going to move to our next panel, Platforms as Choice Architects. And let me introduce our moderator, Joost Rietveld. So Joost is Assistant Professor of Strategic Marketing at UCL School of Management. His research interests are at the intersection of technology strategy and innovation management. And you guessed it, one of his favorite topics is digital platforms. So I met Joost a few years ago with Benoit in Amsterdam. He invited us to an academic seminar, and one of the insights that emerged from the event was that the industry needed more collaboration between academics, practitioners, and policymakers. So here we go. So Joost, over to you.
Great, thank you, Laura, and thank you for facilitating that cross-pollination. And welcome everyone here to this panel on platforms as choice architects. So I think this is an excellent topic for a panel about platforms. We increasingly make decisions with the help of platforms. We search for information on Google. We explore romantic partners on Tinder. We consume entertainment on our smartphones as well as various other platforms. And in all these examples, platforms both present us with options and help us decide on whatever option is the right choice for us. So this renders platforms choice architects. Choice architecture is the design of different ways in which choices can be presented to consumers and the impact of that presentation on consumer decision-making. For example, choice architects can impact decision-making by changing the number of options consumers have. In the context of platforms, this would include content curation. Choice architects also influence decision-making by considering how choice attributes are described and presented. This would include the order in which search results are presented on Google, or the type of posts that an algorithm or a platform editor selectively promotes. Choice architects can also influence decision-making by setting options as defaults, such as privacy settings or integrating key functionality into a platform's core design. Thus, platforms nudge our behavior through their various design choices. These nudges clearly aren't neutral, and they are likely driven by a multitude of incentives. On the one hand, a thoughtful design of choice architecture can improve consumer decision-making by minimizing biases and errors that arise as a result of bounded rationality. On the other hand, what is right for the consumer may not always be optimal for the platform and vice versa. For example, when Facebook implemented a change in its content promoting algorithm to foster meaningful social interactions, it resulted in stronger engagement rates, thus benefiting the platform. But it also led to a decline in mental well-being among users as the algorithm promoted content that was perceived as divisive and negative by users. A platform's choice architecture does not exclusively pertain to its end users either. Platforms also influence the behavior of other users on the platform, including sellers, developers, and content creators. For example, by giving social performance badges to microfinance institutions, Kiva can nudge these institutions to shift the composition of their loan portfolios. In sum, choice architecture is a multidimensional governance tool that platforms can use to create value for their various users, as well as for themselves. So we have a great panel with some really great panelists who will come at these topics from a diverse range of backgrounds. I will start by briefly introducing our panelists. They will then each have about 5 minutes to present their views on platforms as choice architects. After we've heard all three presentations, I will then follow up with some questions for each panelist. And if you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to pop them in the chat. I will keep an eye out for them and raise them to the panelists, time permitting. Our first panelist is Adam Cohen. Adam Cohen is Economic Policy Director at Google. Adam has an AV from Harvard and an MSc from the London School of Economics. Prior to joining Google in 2010, he was an economics correspondent for Dow Jones in the Wall Street Journal. Adam has thought deeply about Google's products, including Google Search, and how these products create choice for consumers. He also has detailed knowledge of how Google Search has evolved over time with an eye towards delivering high-quality search experience for users, and how Google's products fit into the broader competitive landscape. Our second panelist is Tobias Kretschmer. Tobias Kretschmer is Professor of Management at the Munich School of Management, where he is the head of the Institute for Strategy, Technology and Organization, or ISTO. Tobias's research interests include competitive strategy, network industries, organization design, and applied industrial organization. Tobias has done some really interesting work on platform architecture and multi-homing in the context of console video games, as well as research on rewarding user engagement in the context of Facebook, which makes him a really good addition to this panel. And our third panelist is Stefan Hunt. Stefan Hunt is the Chief Data and Technology Insight Officer at the Competition and Markets Authority, or CMA. Stefan has a PhD in economics from Harvard and a BA in experimental psychology from Cambridge. He currently is an honorary professor in economics at the University of Nottingham. As part of his role as Chief Data and Technology Insight Officer, Stefan helps develop and deliver an effective data and digital insight strategy to enable the CMA to better understand the impact that data, machine learning, and other algorithms have on markets and consumers. Adam, if that's okay with you, I'd like to start with you and hear your views on this topic of platforms as choice architects.
Yeah, thank you, Joost. And I don't know if someone can help me present slides. I have a very limited user interface on my version of Zoom. I shared a few slides. There we go. And thanks for having me. It's very nice to be with you all. If we could flip to the next slide, please. I focus on regulatory issues for Google. I've dealt with a range of different legislative files and competition investigations. And in the process of those cases, of those situations, I've learned a lot about questions of user interface and product design, which often are at the core of these types of questions about tech regulation or how specific companies and specific products should be revised or adapted to answer specific types of concerns. I think generally speaking, when Google thinks about these different types of issues, well-designed user interfaces lead to good technology products. The motto around Google is focus on the user and the rest follow. So our goal is always to create value for the user. And it's important to get these things right. I mean, we can think about where there's really good user interfaces that lead to successful products and greater adoption of those products. I think if you think back to the early days of computing, the user interfaces were incredibly complicated and hard to navigate. And if you look at that middle window on the slide, some of the early successful desktop computers simplified that user design and really led to a widespread adoption of that technology. I think Google would think about this much the same way. We are presenting a user interface that helps people navigate an unbelievable number of choices and complexity, which is the huge diversity of information available on the World Wide Web. Let's skip to the next slide, please. So as users are navigating technology, we do have to think through the choices that they're presented with, the choices that they might want to make, the choices they might not want to make, and reckon with the fact that they are going to have to potentially make hundreds of different choices in very quick succession as they're using increasingly complicated technology products. This creates an obvious need for us to grapple with questions like, when do we present choice? When is a specific set of choices required? What do you do about defaults? All of these types of decisions have to be made when you're designing technology products. We'll go to the next slide, please. And we have to also recognize the fact that these types of choices can increase friction and decrease the usability of a product. Just to think of an example, if every time people are now paying with their phones, tokenized credit cards, if every time you tap your phone on a payment terminal, your phone beeps and says, do you really want to pay with this credit card? That increases friction. That type of choice might actually, remind you that you have more than one payment instrument that you can use, but it can also irritate you and reduce your ability to use or your desire to use these different products. So this matrix is a way of thinking about this. We can, if you look at the x-axis, This is really about the relevance of the choice to the user. How important is this choice going to be to them? If you look at the y-axis, you can think about a measure of that friction that I described, where the user sees increased friction and where there might be a lower friction or a less intrusive approach to presenting that choice. Our general view is that where you have forced choices that aren't very relevant, it is a turnoff to the user. Where you have forced choices that are helpful, it increases value. So I can think of the green boxes. You can think of some examples like a seatbelt warning in a car. That's a successful forced choice from our perspective. We go to the next slide, please. So this is just something for folks to think about. We can talk about it. I don't want to take up too much time, but when we're thinking about that trade-off between friction and relevance, what are the frequency of choices we'll be presenting? What type of UI does that entail? How complex will it be? How accessible and understandable is it going to be to the user? How important is this choice going to be? If we're going to create a moment of friction, if we're going to present some type of choice screen, or we're going to force the user to consider various options, what are the costs and the benefits involved in that? That's something that our designers are thinking through and testing very rigorously for everything that we design. Just one last slide, thanks. So just food for thought, a few ideas on some general principles that we might apply to enabling and promoting effective user choice, ensuring that the choices are proportional, that the friction is necessary and helpful and increases the overall welfare of the user and potentially of an ecosystem. That two, and this is critical, that choices be comprehensible and understandable to the user, that they're not overwhelming, that they're not deceptive, certainly, but that they help increase information that's flowing to the user. And the last one is we would think that choices should be made in the right context. So when you're using a particular product relevant to your goals, are we presenting a choice that's going to be relevant in that particular moment? Those are, I mean, there's a lot more to each of those points. I've taken up enough time, but just I think something for us on this panel and this discussion to think about. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Adam. That's really, really interesting. So before I ask questions, I'd like to hear from all three of the panelists. So I would invite Tobias to present his views, if that's okay with him.
That's perfectly okay with me. Thank you very much, Joost. Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Also, thanks very much, Adam, who I think provides a wonderful complement to what I'm going to focus on. So Adam focused on the user choice side. And of course, if we think of platforms, the point of many of them is to connect different sides. And so the choice on one side and the way that choices are presented on one side will affect the options that are available on the other side. So I'm going to switch and I'm going to focus on the complementer side. And if I talk about complementers, these could be developers for apps, these could be sellers for e-commerce platforms, or content creators on media platforms. And when I think about approaches to orchestrate that side of the market, I think you can really distinguish between two polar opposites. One is more a curating approach or controlling approach, and the other one is more of a nudging or a rewards-based approach. And I think often when we have that discussion, we tend to dismiss one or dismiss the other depending on what's more fashionable or more seems more intuitive. I'd like to kind of make the point that both, I believe, are intuitive. Both can make sense depending on where you come from and what some of the key assumptions are about the operations of the platform. So if we think of the platform starting as a starting point, if we think of the platform as a firm that requires certain inputs, then of course it makes sense to assign some third party, some external players, some specific roles for producing certain inputs, right? That's what regular firms do when they outsource certain parts of their production process. Now, the platform in that case will control what the overall value proposition is. So they have a very clear idea of what it is they want to deliver, and then adds external content to their own content to complete that value proposition. On the other hand, if we think of the platform as the often technical or sometimes commercial or transactional infrastructure for an ecosystem in which 1,000 flowers bloom, so in which we basically have an ecosystem of free joining, leaving, inventing complementers, then the overall value proposition that the ecosystem provides is not fixed by the platform. It's not something that the platform will be able to determine very closely, but rather it emerges from the way that complementers and the platform itself will interact with each other. So here the platform does not control and does not especially want to limit the degree of innovation or the innovativeness, the creativity of the complementers, but rather influence their direction. So just to give some examples of one and the other. So when we think of the curating or controlling approach, of course, whenever you have platforms that provide some first-party complements, in other words, if they produce some of the content themselves, or if they produce certain apps, certain games by themselves, and then they assign contracts or they sign contracts with third-party providers for specific games, that would be more of a curating approach. Apple's approval policy for apps, which basically has app developers submit certain apps, and then Apple approves according to some quality criteria if this particular app can join and can be featured on the App Store or not. Or Amazon Store's vetting process in very much the same way. These would be examples where the decisions are made, the decisions for complements to join and what kind of complements to be providing what kind of content are made with the overall ecosystem, either present or envisaged in the future, in mind. We think of nudging, so the more nudging approach. These would be soft incentives that Facebook, so Joost kindly referenced my paper, on Facebook in the early stages. Facebook set very soft incentives for apps developers to join Facebook, and basically rewarded those apps that were able to engage users more by allowing them to send out more notifications to engage users even more, right? So that's a nudging approach in the sense that you're setting incentives to allow or to reward certain kinds of complements. Also, featured apps on Android, or as Joost has pointed out, certificates, features on Kiva. These would be more nudging incentives that also will have, of course, an impact on the overall way that the ecosystem is set up, but not in the hard way that curating would do, but rather nudging. An interesting intermediate case is, for example, YouTube's policy of having allowed monetization based on the number of subscribers that a certain YouTube channel has and on prior success, therefore. So on the one hand, you are rewarding, or YouTube has been rewarding successful and engaging YouTube channels, but at the same time, they used a curating or a controlling approach through applying these hard criteria of needing a minimum number of subscribers to even be able to monetize videos on there. Now, thinking about the effects of these two approaches, I think curating has the advantage that it might be efficient in the short run, because there you avoid what, especially in the video game industry, we call the Atari effect of having lots of bad, or having a confusing array of bad and low quality and often very poorly differentiated complements. The negative part is that curating or applying hard criteria will exclude a number of complementers, which may in fact promote the emergence of a competing platform, because all these excluded developers will maybe leave and join elsewhere, right? So this is actually what happens with YouTube, because lots of the YouTube content creators have been joining Patreon. Nudging has the advantage that you may get a more creative, more dynamic ecosystem, while at the same time, it doesn't have the problem of promoting competing platforms. Rather, it may lead to a single complementers becoming very powerful on the platform, as we have seen in the very high-profile lawsuit between Epic and Apple, where clearly the complementer has become very powerful on a particular platform. So I think I've used up my time. So just to summarize, I think both approaches have their justification, and which one is more appropriate in which context depends a lot on how strong the value created is under the control of the platform, or if it depends on the creativity of complementers. And secondly, it depends on the importance of constant renewal. So that would speak more for nudging, or a stability in the ecosystem, which would speak for more curating. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Tobias. And clearly, I think the comments made by Tobias and Adam are very intertwined, right? Because what a platform does on the end user side will affect their developers and vice versa. All right, Stefan, thank you for joining us. Would you share your thoughts with us next, please?
Thanks very much, Joost. You've really done a very great job on this panel in bringing together some very complementary viewpoints. I guess my first point is that, you know, platforms as choice architects often do really fantastic jobs. I just had to set up a new Android phone just last week as a new work phone, and it was a fantastic experience. The only thing that wasn't great was the security part that my owner organization had put on. That was the only thing that was a bit glitchy, but otherwise the choice architecture was, yeah, it felt really good from a user perspective. You know, I'm a huge fan of Amazon, as I'm sure you all are, and especially knowing how to navigate their choice architecture, I find it incredibly useful. Nonetheless, organizations like mine, so competition and consumer agencies, think about choice architecture really quite actively. So, to give some example pieces of work, at the Competition and Markets Authority, we did a big piece of work on digital advertising, focusing on Facebook and Google recently, and that's focusing on search, social networks, and digital advertising. We're currently undertaking a piece of work on mobile ecosystems, focusing on Apple and Google, and that's on the competition side of, or primarily on the competition side of what we do. There's also a lot of work on the consumer side as well. So we've done work on hotel booking platforms, car hire, and other work as well. And obviously what we're concerned about is potentially harmful online choice architecture. There's loads of great stuff, but we care about the stuff where we think that there may be harm to consumers, and potentially we can make things better. Harmful online choice architectures, that's going to include, on the most part, dark patterns, sludge, dark nudges. These concepts are broadly nested within normally subsets of harmful online choice architecture. Now, part of the context of us caring about platforms as choice architects is there's currently proposals in the UK that there will be a new digital markets unit, and that there's going to be some ex-ante regulation of large technology firms. So obviously within that, the DMU, which is currently in shadow form, will need to be thinking and understanding choice architecture. Now, again, lots of positives, but we care about harm that can occur in 3 different ways. So one is choice architecture can distort consumers' decision-making directly. This is known in consumer law as sort of transactional decisions, and it can lead them to purchase unsuitable or unneeded products, spend more than they want to, receive poor value items or service, or search less for alternatives. Really good example here would be our hotel bookings work, where we were really concerned about false scarcity claims that were nudging people in particular directions, some reference pricing that again was nudging people as well, and a really important additional item was some non-disclosed paid for search ranking, and as we all know, orders in lists can be very powerful ways of nudging people in particular directions. interactions. So the second thing that we're going to care about is whether choice architecture can help firms to establish their positions in the market, either gaining market power or maintaining it or squeezing rivals out. A big concern that's been in the competition world is, with respect to an example we'll all be aware of, is default positions in search, and this digital advertising piece that we talked about. As part of that study, Google submitted that in 2019 it made a total of just under 1.2 billion in default payments, and that's on UK search traffic alone. And the vast majority of that was to, or the substantial majority of that was to Apple. So that's really quite a significant sum. Why might they be interested in doing that? So we know from the Commission's work on the effect of default payments, this is, let me explain what the data is. So it's from 5 different countries: France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom, between 2014 and 2017. First of all, we're going to look on Android devices, and we could see on Android devices that Google Search accounted for 90 to 100% of search on those devices, and Bing was, of course, just 10 to 20%. However, if we went on to Windows Mobile, I'm sure there's a hell of a lot less on Windows Mobile in 2014 to 2017, but we could see that actually this was amazingly, for those who've experienced the products, that actually Bing still accounted for between 10 and 50% of vary by country by year, which I think of as actually remarkably high for those who've experienced it. So we know that these defaults can have very strong effects. Now, of course, I note that there's been focus on choice screens in Europe. This is pre-Brexit, affects the UK as well, and that actually things have really changed since. But I guess my point is that defaults can really make a difference, and we might care about it in a variety of ways. And the third thing that we're going to care about is how, once firm has market power, how it might exploit its position. So I'm not necessarily referring here that there's any market power, but I'm going to note that Benedict Evans recently, I saw him tweeting about Apple's ATT and how they described the choice architecture they used to describe whether you wanted to provide data towards Apple versus you went to provide data to other third parties. Completely different framing of what is essentially a very similar question. So I've just got a couple more points, then I'll finish up. So one is, so to the extent that the platforms have got choice architecture that we might care about, what can we do? Well, there's a variety of things we can do on the consumer and the firm side. I'm just going to focus on a couple of them that I think are quite interesting. So one is, currently BEIS is consulting on some potential changes to the law. So this would be banning certain classes of dark pattern. Another interesting proposal comes from Lauren Willis, the Loyola Law School, and she's focusing on the idea of performance-based consumer law. So you actually might have rules and regulations, but they might be that 80% of consumers need to understand the major features in a particular situation. Of course, that can then allow for, we can give firms their sort of wonderful freedom and flexibility they have to design things, but making sure that actually consumers can understand sufficiently. And my final point is, you mentioned some of the skills in my team, but also we have these sort of behavioral scientists as well. I think it's going to be really important that we make sure that we have the right kind of technical capability within agencies to make sure that we can work with platforms, like Google as well, and that we can help make sure that we can ourselves nudge things, in this case, more potentially businesses rather than consumers, but we can help nudge businesses in the right direction over time. And that's going to involve, I think, some rigorous empirics and some testing.
Great. Thank you, Stefan. That's really, really insightful. Thanks. Okay, so I would like to move on to asking each of you some questions. Again, I would also welcome questions from the audience, and if I'm directing someone, but someone else has a complementary view, feel free to jump in. So I wanted to start with Adam. So one thing that I picked up on from your deck was so Google wants to help consumers make good choices quickly, and so one question I had is how does Google define whether the choice has been good? How does one define good, and how do you measure whether the choices that have been made were actually in the benefit of the consumer?
It's a very good question, and I think there are different answers for different circumstances. One thing I just want to say, I think to Stefan's point, I think I completely agree. It's going to be really important that the way that we do this type of product design and we do the type of testing and objectives that we and other platforms and other companies set out for themselves is that we're designing these products, that we really help you and other regulators understand the choices that we're making, the trade-offs and the evaluation process that goes into that. So I think that I really welcome that type of collaboration or cooperation between at least our company and regulators. I think, Joost, to your more specific question about how do we, what's our metric for success? I think it will vary a lot by product. I mean, in search, for example, and one of the things that we've always used is long clicks versus short clicks, or re-queries and retargeting of queries. So, for example, somebody comes to Google and searches for something, and they go off and click somewhere, and they never come back and search for something again. We'd call that a long click. We tend to think of that as success. If somebody comes back to Google and very quickly searches for something, or again, or slightly changes their query, we might not have done a very good job. And we use that type of feedback mechanism to determine whether or not, in that specific example, that's a good design or not. I think there's also, and this comes back to how much choice and how much friction should you present to the consumer. You take your mobile phone and all of the world of apps and complementers that have been described on those devices, and you could present an unlimited number of features, of applications, of choices for consumers. And I think that sometimes in conversations that I've had with regulators, it's been a question of, well, why don't you let users make all of these choices for themselves? And I think that there is a general expectation from a consumer that the products that they get, not all of them are sophisticated enough to make these choices for all of the different types of underlying features on the device. Are you going to be able to pick the right GPS component? Probably not, but you can probably pick and choose among the different mapping services that are available through an application store or some other distribution mechanism. So I think it's about presenting smart choices and making sure that consumers are informed of those choices, and that they also have, I think there's another layer of this that's very important, they also have platforms that are technically capable of being changed and altered in the ways that the consumers want to use them. One thing that comes to mind talking about defaults, Microsoft devices do not come with Google search pre-installed. They only come with Bing, which is to contrast with Android devices, which can come with multiple search engines pre-installed, and including having rival search services sit right there alongside our own. One thing that's interesting is that for Bing, the #1 search query globally is Google. So I think that gives you some sense that users do have the capability of overriding some of these choices, particularly when they feel that they're not made in their interests or that they don't suit them very well.
Great, thank you. That's an interesting anecdote to end on, but you're right. So one of the points that I also wrote down is I think you're probably constantly presented with kind of presenting choice with avoiding choice overload. And you briefly touched on that, and I imagine that to be a very wicked, challenging problem for any tech company. Tobias, so you presented this interesting, say, framework of kind of curation versus nudging, and that platforms sometimes use one or the other, and potentially they use both. I think many platforms do use both. So in your view, to what extent does getting that balance right, to what extent does that impact a platform's ultimate success? And maybe also, do you think that that balance shifts depending on certain contingencies, the type of platform or where a platform is in its life? I realize that that's two separate questions. Feel free to either answer either one of them or both if you can.
Right. I hope I haven't forgotten the first one before I start answering. So, I mean, I think generally speaking, yes, it depends. I think definitely getting it right, getting the balance right, is super important for the success of a platform. And I think that what I'd like to avoid is giving off the impression that there's one right solution for every kind of platform, or for even for the same platform at different points in time. So, I mean, just if we, you did mention that I have done quite a bit of work on video games, and so that tends to be an industry I know well. But for example, if we think of kind of what started off the industry was Atari, which was a tremendously successful platform. Now, that platform started out with being completely open, right? So it was very, very open when it came to content creation. So anyone could just get together and come up with a game that would then be sold via the Atari platform. And that was fairly successful early on, but then it became such a disaster that now we're talking about the Atari shock as kind of an example of how not to curate a platform, how not to run a platform through time. So I think that's one example of clearly where a system worked well early on, but then it failed to be adjusted in the right way. Thinking of Nintendo had a tradition, or had a common practice of having a very large share of curated content in the early phases of their life cycle, which I think was necessary to establish an ecosystem, to establish sort of the parameters of the ecosystem. But then after a while, clearly the model by which Nintendo was managing their platform changed significantly, and so there more openness seemed to be the right approach in later stages of the life cycle. So I do think that over time, these platforms will change behavior. I mean, for a researcher, this is wonderful because you get all these rule changes over time, which allow you to do wonderful statistical analysis on what effects these rule changes have had, right? So when I talked about YouTube and the rule change, that's something that we're exploring right now. And I think it is interesting that you started out with very liberal rules for monetization of content on YouTube. And then as you sort of let a thousand flowers bloom for a while, then YouTube started issuing hard and soft nudges, or hard and soft rules for exclusion or inclusion into that monetization scheme. And so this is what we're studying right now. And it seems, interestingly, that may well have cut out a number of potentially very interesting and very lucrative content creators from YouTube, who then went on to Patreon and basically strengthened a competing platform. So I do think that there's a lot of active management of orchestrating the complementer side, which of course has its partners or its counterparts on the user side, as Adam has explained, right? So there's lots of changes that keep on happening, and I think that's exactly the same at the complementer side. Now, I do think, just to kind of get back to your first question, whether this depends also on the type of platform, I do think so. I have a feeling it does, but I couldn't give you a definite answer of whether transaction platforms would be better off more or less in terms of openness or curating versus nudging. But I think there's a lot of answers to be sought in that domain too.
Great, thanks. And obviously that means that there is a fruitful opportunity for future research for folks like you and I to explore further. And also maybe in the case of Nintendo, there might be interesting kind of like platform lifecycle dynamics as well as macroeconomic factors, right? Because Nintendo kind of stepped in the industry right after Atari ruined it for everyone, and so Nintendo kind of needed to make good on behalf of the entire industry. All right, so Stefan, I really enjoyed your remarks, and I potentially appreciated kind of these three indicators for harm that you are looking at with the CMA. So one question that I had is, so how do you measure whether a platform uses choice architecture techniques to kind of serve its own objectives, right? And how do you measure the extent to which this is problematic? You mentioned some examples, but how do we know that this is in fact bad for consumers? And because I imagine it can be quite hard to observe the counterfactual, if you will. So how do you get at that? How do you establish these harmful practices?
That's a great question. So it's obviously a very similar question to what you asked to Adam. How do we measure what's good? I mean, so, and I noticed there was a question in the chat as well that really talks about the same kind of thing, which is all about impact on consumer welfare versus profit. So I guess a few things to say on that. So inherently welfare is a multi-dimensional thing, right? Like there's none of us have any one metric, or very few of us, I assume, have any one metric that covers all of our welfare. And so we probably need to be thinking about a few different things that we want to measure. And obviously we need to understand the particular situation that we care about, right? We need to have some kind of model in mind as to what might be going on. Now, I'm going to slightly get a bit academic and geeky, but I promise this is actually practical. I mean, when we're talking about the fact that choice architecture works, what we're showing is there's stuff that is not inherently rational that influences behavior, right? So that in of itself shows that we're not perfectly rational, the fact that these things work. So we inherently need some kind of behavioral models. This is behavioral in the sense of behavioral economics, in order to understand consumer behavior. And if we can think about what's best for people, obviously we want a welfare model. So we want some behavioral welfare model to try and understand what's going on. So that clearly within itself has to try to explain how people are making choices, but also how are people making mistakes, potentially, right? And so when we've got that model in mind, we then need to use a model like that will have multi-dimensional aspects to it, and try to judge whether we think different choice architectures are benefiting consumers or not. Now that sounds kind of hard and it sounds kind of geeky, but actually it can really work in practice. Now let me give an example of where it worked in practice. This isn't a platform example. So many years ago, I was part of a team that was responsible for designing a price cap for payday loans. And my job was to design the analysis that we were going to be using. And we really cared about, one thing we really cared about was whether for people who are just on the margin of getting payday loans, were they actually harmed or not, right? And so we thought about it. We understand there's actually one of the real issues from a welfare perspective is whether people are showing addictive-like behavior in the use of payday loans. So we have to think about, for those who know it, hyperbolic discounting and these kind of things. So we've got an underlying model of what might be going wrong or not. And so in this case, we got incredibly good data. We entered the top 36 firms. We used our legal powers. We got all of the loans made over a couple of years in the UK. We matched all the individuals across the 36 different firms. For 11 large firms, we had all of the denied and all of the accepted loans. So we could actually, there was a causal identification technique we could use. And then we matched in the full credit reference agency files for everyone, and then we did a survey on top actually as well. So there was millions of people in our data set. And then actually we had really good rigorous evidence that people on the margin of receiving payday loans were negatively affecting their credit scores by 20%, were actually borrowing more afterwards than less, and then a variety of other measures. So we had an underlying model, we had some good evidence, we could basically show that people were being harmed or not. That's those. Now, you don't need to do as much as that. thank goodness. And often if you've got a good experiment, that's going to be kind of what you need, right? But there's absolutely ways that you can do this stuff in practice, and it really doesn't have to be excruciatingly hard.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that sounds super interesting and also super hard. So I want to be mindful of the time. We only have about a minute left. So very quick question, I guess, for Adam. So you've presented some of these things that you think about and that you work on, mostly with regards to Google search, and I know that you've also kind of thought deeply about kind of the competitive landscape when it comes to search. And so kind of in your view, how much do the things that you've presented today kind of really contribute to kind of Google's competitiveness in that search landscape?
I think it's essential to build a good product that people want to use and that they find useful. One thing I think maybe Stefan mentioned, paid search, the inclusion of paid links in search. I don't know if folks remember, but before Google became popular, something that was very common with search engines is that they would include paid advertisements within the links, or there would be these really obtrusive pop-ups where new advertisements would open when you thought you were clicking on a relevant link. And one of the great innovations of Google 20 odd years ago was that we stopped doing that. And it was one of the reasons why people migrated so quickly to using Google and enjoying it. And even to this day, we see that users are acutely aware of the difference between what we call the organic unpaid links on a search results page and the paid advertising links on that page. So we really helped educate users about a difference, but that followed the demand for something that was a better interface, clearer choice, and more transparency around those choices. So I think that the two have to go hand in hand. And again, I come back to an early motto of the company, which is focus on the user and the rest will follow. So I think that's been a big part of our success.
Great, thank you so much. I could keep talking to you for hours. I have many more questions, but we need to wrap up. So Adam, Stefan, Tobias, thank you very much for your time and for your very, very helpful and interesting insights.